Do you want me to use that? I'm already very blunt here. Okay. Well, thank you, Chair. A very good evening to everyone. So before I begin my presentation, the topic is a comparative study. So I'm going to compare two different situations. So let me give you a brief background on what these two situations are, and I'll start with my personal story. So I was born to Tibetan refugee parents in India, and my parents had to flee Tibet because of the Chinese invasion in 1959. So I was born in India. In India, we have established our own Tibetan refugee community. We have established our own exile government. We have exile parliament. We also have Exile Tibetan Charter, within which, in the preamble of that charter, UDHR is, Universal Declaration of Human Rights is enshrined as the, guiding force of the whole document. So we also have what we call as Bill of Rights in that charter. So, so as a kid, growing up in a refugee school, we became informed about UDHR and other human rights principles from a very early age. So because we always had to participate in these annual protest marches, and we knew that there was something wrong with where we came from, and we learned about things like peace, justice, human rights from a very early age. So what I'm going to talk about is what is happening regarding human rights education within Tibet, which is under the Chinese Communist Party's rule. So the governance model, to understand the background situation in Tibet, it is very important to understand the governance model of the Chinese Communist Party. We are talking about one-party state. And also within Tibet, there is no independent judiciary, no independent media, no human rights at all. Human rights itself is a very sensitive topic, and if you were, caught discussing issues like human rights or independence or about our spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, you might get arrested and also tortured and also imprisoned. So I would like to start with the story of 10 monks who were arrested and sentenced to prison for as long as 19 years just for translating the UDHR in Tibetan language in Tibet and then distributing it among the Tibetan people. So that's how the Chinese government criminalized the UDHR itself. And that happened in 1988. And 1988 was the year when the Chinese government first recognized the existence of the Human Rights Day itself. So within Tibet, what we see is that, the UDHR assumes a very important place in the history of the Tibetan freedom struggle, because in 1988 it was the 40th year anniversary of the adoption of the UDHR, and that was when the Chinese government recognized publicly the existence of the Human Rights Day. And in the late 1980s, 10 monks from Drebung Monastery in the Tibetan capital Lhasa were arrested, sentenced, and since that day, we have been celebrating the UDHR anniversary of the Tibetan, translation of UDHR. So this year marks the 70th anniversary of the UDHR, but it also marks the 30th anniversary of the Tibetan Declaration of UDHR in Tibetan language. And then right to education, as we learned yesterday from other speakers, that culturally relevant education is very important when we talk about human rights education. Inside Tibet, what we have seen is that the right to education itself is denied to Tibetans. There is no culturally relevant education, and also Tibetan language, itself is marginalized. In Tibet, the implementation of the bilingual education system by the Chinese language, what happened, the impact of that policy is that Tibetan language is now no longer the medium of education in Tibetan schools within Tibet. So there is no human rights education at all, but on top of that, the right to education itself is in a very difficult situation. And then we are also talking about within the school curriculum from the primary to higher secondary schools, students are required to take compulsory course on political and ideological courses. I mean, these courses require young kids to learn about the histories of the communist revolutionaries, and then you also have to learn communist songs. Since this is exactly what is happening in all these re-education camps that you hear so much about these days in the mainstream media. In all these Uyghurs, people are being sent, millions of them are being sent to all these re-education camps. So what is happening in this re-education camp? What are they learning? What kind of re-education are Uyghurs and Tibetans given, in these detention centers? What they learn is how to be a loyal Communist Party member. And this is totally opposite to what we know about human rights education. It is anti-human rights. And then also, not just kids, but older people are also required, forced to attend these re-education classes. And it's not just happening in Xinjiang or the homeland of the Uyghurs, but also in Tibet Autonomous Region and other Tibetan areas outside of Tibet Autonomous Region, in other provinces like Qinghai, Sichuan, Gansu, and Yunnan. So in this, back in 2012, mass re-education camps had been already set up in the Tibetan areas, because hundreds of Tibetans in 2012, they traveled to India to receive the blessings from their spiritual leader Dalai Lama, and they wanted to attend this very sacred religious teaching called Kala Chakra. And upon their return to Tibet, they were detained. So we are talking about all these ad hoc detention facilities like guest houses, even hotel rooms were overnight turned into detention facilities. People as old as 80-year-old women were detained in these facilities. And of course, they were given communist education, the re-education policy, how to be loyal to the government. So in common parlance, we would call it, washing the brain, the washing the brain business. So people have to behave in a way that the government requires them to behave. So this is the story of the so-called minority peoples in the minority population in the People's Republic of China. And then we also have there is this outline on the Ministry of Education has published this outline of the National Medium and Long-Term Educational Reform and Development Plan. Now, this is a programmatic document on the education policy of the whole of People's Republic of China, including Tibet and Xinjiang. And when we look at that document, we see that there is not a single mention of human rights at all in that document. And it was issued by the Ministry of Education. Normally we would expect the Ministry of Education to take the responsibility of, providing human rights education, but we don't see that, and also in this outline. And on top of that, the Chinese government also, they issued 3 different action plans, what they call as National Human Rights Action Plan. The first was issued in 2009. So this was the first sort of like public expression from the government that human rights protection and promotion of human rights will be the goal, will be the national goal. But then when we have been through 3 plans already, starting from 2009, and the third one is ongoing, But again, we have not seen any kind of, specification or a definition of human rights itself in that plan, which means that it is very convenient for the government to interpret human rights as it wishes, because what we have seen at the policy level in China is that there is more focus on domestic law rather than the international human rights standards. So it's very easy for the government to say like, okay, this is human rights education without calling it human rights as such. But then they would say that, okay, it is important for you to protect your body without saying that, right to freedom, right to liberty. They won't use that term, which means that, there is this, they are actually trying to shy away from, using human rights publicly and acknowledging that it is human rights as we understand based on the international human rights standards. So these are not available in the current system of so-called human rights education in China. And then there is also no systematic human rights education either at the primary, junior, or secondary schools, and also at the higher education level. As we heard also from the previous panel from two professors from China, that human rights education is restricted only at the tertiary level. It is taught to college and university students, but below that, when we look at the schools like primary and secondary school, there is there's total absence of any human rights education in the school curriculum. And then also in the I'll just give you an example on the ideology and politics textbook for senior secondary school students in China. So in that, what we see is that they talk about political life, quote unquote, and common sense of law in life, quote unquote, but then there is no human rights as such, mentioned. So it's up to the government and also up to the teacher to interpret as they wish. So the kids are confused. They don't know what they are learning. And also, I think it is also important to emphasize here that the way laws and policies are implemented in China is very different from, say, like Tibet. So in Tibet, when a regulation is implemented based on a national law, it has this very strong political content. So what we see, the version of the ideology and political course in Tibet is, has some really strong political language, like, it is, a crime to engage in separatist activities and that sort of thing. So, which we think has nothing to do with human rights education in itself. And then I would like to show you a picture. So this is a very old document in Tibetan language. It is the first Tibetan translation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was drafted in the early 1960s, and it was revised in 1970. So this is the the 1970 copy, which I received from a friend in London. So this is, I guess this is one of the very few surviving copies. So this text was first translated into Tibetan by His Holiness the Dalai Lama in the early 60s. At the time, the translation of UDHR itself, it had like a lot of these religious, overtones. Because I'll just give you an example. It was translated as Zamling Geji Doa, I'm sorry, I'm speaking in Tibetan, Zamling Geji Doa Mi Kunche Toptang Seda, which literally means that declaration of the morals and the rights of humans in the international world. So it sounds quite funny because should sound like UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but that was back in the 60s, and then it was revised, and now the official term for UDHR in Tibetan is Dormi Thoptang Yong Kap Seda. So it's very close to what it exactly means in English. So that was what we Tibetans, when we first came into exile in India, we wanted to have the UDHR translated in Tibetan. We fled to India in 1959, but just several years after that, we wanted UDHR in Tibetan, and we disseminated this text among the Tibetan population, and that was how it was incorporated into our charter, the Tibetan Charter. And then also from 1960s to 1990s in exile community, we have seen quite a lot of activities regarding human rights education. We have also seen civil society organizations being founded, and then there had been quite a lot of workshops, capacity building workshops, training sessions, within which school children, activists, and the monastic population also participated actively. Where monks and nuns learned about human rights conventions and other treaties. Our organization was founded in 1996. So since then, we have translated almost all the core UN human rights documents in Tibetan. And what we do is that we try to share these Tibetan translation with our with other Tibetans within Tibet, because they do not have any access to these UN human rights documents in their own language. But then it is getting more difficult nowadays with the state censorship and surveillance. Of course, internet is the most popular medium through which you try to disseminate UN documents. And also, lastly, I would like to emphasize why HRE in Tibetan language is important. It is important because Tibet is one of the longest running human rights catastrophes in the world. And we are talking about more than 5,000 Tibetan political prisoners since 1991, recorded in our organization's political prisoner database. And secondly, Tibetans are considered as one of the 55 minority nationalities in the People's Republic of China. So due to their minority status within PRC, their language, their rights are being undermined on a daily basis. So that's why it's very important to provide human rights education in Tibetan language more than ever. And then also the fact that the situation in Xinjiang, we have heard a lot about the Uyghurs, but then what I would like you to know about is that the current party secretary of Xinjiang Autonomous Region, Mr. Ten Zhongbo, was the party secretary of the Tibet Autonomous Region. He was transferred to Xinjiang in 2016. And what we see now had already happened within the Tibet Autonomous Region. So when you compare the re-education camps within China to the human rights education HRE situation within Tibet, we get a picture where there is no way that citizens can access human rights education, let alone in their own language. But the basic text that we take for granted in the free world, access to these documents, UDHR itself is criminalized. And then I'll show you some pictures. This is the first page of that UDHR in Tibetan. The forward to the text. And this is the protest that happened in Lhasa, Tibetan capital Lhasa, in 1988. That was when the monks got arrested because they disseminated Tibetan translations of UDHR during this protest. As you can see, some monks. And this is the first guy who got arrested, sentenced to 9 years for distributing UDHR. Jambe Tsering 5 years, this guy Jambe Lose 10 years, and then Ngawang Puljung 19 years. Again, 17 years, 19 years, 5 years. So he used to work at our organization. After he was released from prison, he joined our organization and worked with us for almost 16 years. Thank you.